Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Francesca Trivellato, who is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of History at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. And we'll be discussing the Jews of Livorno and the city, which was discussed in her book, which was published a number of years ago, called The Familiarity of Strangers, the Sephardic Diaspora, Livorno, and Cross-Cultural Trade in the Early Modern Period. The book is a little bit more on the economic networks of Livorno, but we'll get into some of that as well. So thank you, Professor Trivellato, for joining me.
Well, thank you, Naki, for having me.
My pleasure. So why don't you start off, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, as you said, I approached the topic primarily as a scholar of the pre-industrial economic world of commercial networks, of business networks. And I've always been extremely interested in how marginal groups, and particularly Jews, have defined the relationship between capitalism and modernity. I was not trained, I should say, as a Jewish historian. I'm not Jewish myself, but I think that and particularly in Israel, in the departments of general history, it's, in some universities called Department of General Histories, that it is the Jewish history can be of enormous relevance to understand larger patterns of change, in my case, in the history of Europe. And so I also came across some extraordinary primary sources in archives, which are always for historians an irresistible grip. And so the combination of an intellectual interest, obviously of personal interest and encounters in the course of my life, and these extraordinary documents in the State Archives of Florence, which had been sitting there for centuries, made the cocktail, so to speak, and the book got started. It took many, many years. And then this is in many ways the history of a family partnership and since the Sephardic merchants had business ties that expanded and extended very, very far away, in this case, as far as Northern Europe, Portugal, but also Portuguese India, and what was at the time called the Levant. They had a branch in Aleppo, Syria. I tried to follow their traces to every single place where they had been. In fact, Aleppo, Syria is the only major town where they traded where I didn't go because sadly by the early 2000s, there was no archival remains pertaining to Sephardic Jews, although in the meantime, previously some scholars, including some German scholars, had retrieved some important documents, and others are in Jerusalem. But I went as far as Goa in India to look for archival traces of their presence and their businesses, which was extremely exciting. And I did a lot of research in Lisbon. And so it's a history in many ways of the relationship between Sephardic Jews, their relatives across the diaspora. So it's not just Jews in Livorno, but the Jews based in Livorno and the entire Western Sephardic diaspora, as well as the relationship between the Sephardic diaspora and non-Jews. So these are the three axes. But Livorno is not very well known. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak about this Mediterranean Tuscan town and share the little I've learned over the years with our listeners.
Okay, terrific. So, right, we'll get back more to the Sephardic diaspora, as it's called, and the networks and all that. So let's start with Livorno, or some may know it as Leghorn, and we can mention why it's known as Leghorn, but the name of the Italian name is Livorno. That's the proper name. And where you mentioned it's in Tuscany, where is that? And just kind of, I guess, obviously we're doing this just audio, no map, but so people can look online in Italy. Obviously, you can look where it is today. It's the same place, but maybe just talk a little bit about Livorno.
Yeah, so probably all of your listeners would have a mental picture of the river Arno that crosses the city of Florence, and the famous Ponte Vecchio, the bridge with all the shops that crosses. So the river Arno, if you follow the river Arno westward, it crosses the plain of Tuscany and reaches the Tyrrhenian Sea just close to Livorno. So because of the typical fluvial phenomenon in the early Middle Ages, the Tuscan port was the town of Pisa. And that's also traversed by the river Arno, and that was the major Tuscan port. And with the number of debris that the river accumulates and bring to the sea, the harbor of Pisa was landfilled naturally. So by the 15th century, the harbor of Pisa was no longer highly functional. So Livorno was, until say around 1500, really a small fisherman town, not a particularly healthy place to be, certainly not a wealthy place to be, just a little coastal village. And around the middle of the 16th century, when the Medici family became the dynastic ruler of Tuscany, before they had been the most important family of the Republic of Florence, but they became the dynastic rulers. They became the Grand Dukes of Tuscany. They decided to invest in building Livorno into a really impressive, modern Renaissance city and harbor, so that they could compete, even if they had a small regional state. They were not head of the monarchy of the size of France, of England, but they could have an imprint in the competitive European arena. And the Mediterranean was still a very competitive sea. And Livorno was their outlet into this very competitive Mediterranean world. So they really hired an extraordinary architect of the time. And Livorno, which today unfortunately has been bombarded during World War II, largely by the Allies, because it was on the front line of the war, during World War II, between 43 and 44, when the Allies were coming up south against the Germans. So there was a very important port and a very important train line. And so the extraordinarily beautiful 16th century building, it had a 5-star city wall and extraordinary beautiful harbor from the 16th century. There's very little remain, but you could walk around and see some of those remains, and there's plans that remind us from the time. So Livorno was a model Renaissance city and harbor, and once they built the physical city, the Medici had to make it into an urban living environment, and they created special policies to encourage the settlement, not just of anybody, but of the most entrepreneurial business communities of all around the Mediterranean. Among these, they favored in particular those Jews who had been forcibly converted or expelled from both Spain and Portugal during the last 10 years of the 15th century. So they issued some patents, which are called Livornine, the patents from the city of Livorno, which are addressed to a number of ethno-religious communities, Turks, as they're called, Moors. And later there are, you asked me why the city is called Leghorn, because it became the most important English outpost in the Mediterranean. There's a very large, relatively speaking, English business communities, and the English started to, call it Leghorn. I cannot imitate a British accent. I'm not an English native speaker, so it will be just not quite funny enough. But that's, some Italian cities, the English call it just with their Italian names, with the English pronunciations, and other Italian cities, like the city of Padova, it's called Padua. That's a sort of closer, but they gave, others retain, Verona as in Otello, as in Shakespeare's Verona, they call it Verona, but it's still Verona. So it's just a pronunciation. And other city, Milan, they just drop one letter. But Leghorn, they gave it their own name. And there's a lot of travel accounts in the Encyclopedia Britannica of the 18th century. You see a lot of printed texts from the time that they have the name Leghorn. But these patents, these privileges that the Medici issued contained very special privileges that you could tell if you read the specific articles in them that they are targeting the Spanish and Portuguese, recently converted former Jews specifically. And that's how, from the 1590s, these two patents are dated 1591 and 1593, slowly, today we know how complex migratory movements and refugee crisis and persecutions of groups and minorities and the consequences in terms of the movement of families and so forth are, that you can imagine was even more so when there were no humanitarian corridors or text messages or other forms of communication with which people could inform families or organized rescue missions and so forth. So these Sephardic families slowly passed information among each other, and this news, which the Medici wanted to spread, we know there are a lot of copies of these Livornini, of these patents. They wanted everybody to find out that Livorno would have been a safe haven. And so slowly, but then rapidly, an unusually large Jewish community and unusually well protected, particularly for being Livorno part of a very Catholic state. Remember, the Medici elected a pope. I mean, they were good Catholics, but they created a kind of a special regime for the Jews in Livorno and gave them special protection. So that's how it came to be this particular safe haven. Some of the time called it kind of the Jerusalem of Europe, their expression of the sort.
Right. I mean, Medici, right? There was two Medici popes, exactly. And what you, so first of all, I mentioned Livorno, so it's on the western side of Italy, right? And the Medici were in Florence, like you said, originally before they became the Grand Dukes. And I guess I'm just mentioning this just for people to understand. I guess they do, but just to drive home the point that Italy was not a country at this time till the 19th century. So this was, but like you did say, it was very Catholic, even so, being near Rome. And so this was interesting that this was somewhere there was no ghetto, there was no anything. This was,
this freedom. Was a very unusual. So among the special concession, they were given permission to build a synagogue. It's very interesting because there was, wherever, I mean, you'll have plenty of jokes that you can tell, but, wherever there's a Jewish community, there's more than one synagogue usually. And in Livorno, for all these centuries, there's always been only one synagogue. And there's even some prohibition, obviously wealthy Jews wanted to have their own synagogues at home, but there's always been only one synagogue. And the Medici have been quite successful in not allowing, the kind of fragmentations, even when they're becoming in the 18th century, there's a big public fight between the Sephardi Jews and the Italian Jews. They have different rights, but they always keep. So they build a synagogue, which sadly today doesn't exist. There's a modern synagogue because, as I mentioned, it was bombed in the between 43 and 44. But the not well-to-do Jews basically live congregated in the just in the immediate surroundings around the synagogue. But there is no prohibition for Jews to live, even the wealthy Jews, for Jews in general, to live even along the main thoroughfare of this beautiful Renaissance town, which, because it was really a planned urban landscape, so it had this main thoroughfare, and we have very detailed maps from the period, and we know that some of the wealthy Jewish family that became important business dynasties in the 17th and 18th century owned buildings next door to the wealthiest Christian Catholic families, and they even could rent part of their. Most people had Christian servants who could rent or live in there. There were some prohibition about sharing the staircases, but really, do you have the police come in and check? You go up from the front stairs and you go down from the stairs in the back of the house. So the level of promiscuity, if you wish, by the standards of both Christian and Jewish clerical establishments was very high. And another way of thinking about it, the level of acculturation and mixture was very, very high by the time period when the two society, there was absolutely, there was no, this, not only was Italy very Catholic, but this is the period before the French Revolution, before emancipation. There is no civil marriage for both sides. Protestants, Catholic, Jews. There's only religious marriage. If you want to marry outside of your community, any religious community you belong to, you have to convert. And to convert is to break away socially, not just religiously, from every ties you have. So the level of social segregation maps onto the religious divisions of our community for everybody, not just for Jews. I mean, obviously, Jews are in a subordinate legal and cultural position. But this is a world in which, you cannot choose very much. I mean, your choices are very limited. And so business is a world in which, by privileges, the Medici want to create, they're not going to eliminate the social segregation. They're not going to create civil marriage. I mean, that is not going to happen before the 19th century, before you can have a full citizenship. That's not. But what the Medici do is to say, okay, the Jewish merchants, so men who choose not to be scholars, but to be merchants, can have virtually the same legal rights as Christian merchants. And so they create like a sphere in the marketplace where Jews and non-Jews can interact as peers. And that's what interests me, because Jews never cease to be Jews, because it's not that when you enter the marketplace, everything else in your life ceases to exist. So how do these two worlds of the marketplace and the Jewish life that exist outside? And so it's a fascinating case in which you give Jews a lot of rights that are, if you wish, ahead of the time in one sphere, but you maintain the segregation in the other social family spheres.
Right, absolutely. And what you're saying is so unique about it was kind of like freedom of religion starting out so early. It's in this like unique. It was unique in the whole world, not only really in Italy at the time that this happened. So something else that you kind of mentioned that kind of came up is that, I mentioned this to you before we started recording. I've been told a number of times, people are like, oh, I'm interested in Italian Jewry. I'm talking about Italians, like, oh, Sephardim, where they just mention, oh, Italy was Sephardi. And I don't know where that misconception really comes from, being that it was mainly like, I mean, you talk about this Ashkenazim, and there was Italian Jews, and then you had Sephardi Jews. But I don't know, I'm just making this up. I have no idea if this is true. Maybe some of this somehow comes from Livorno, because Livorno was a predominantly Sephardi city in Italy. And we'll talk about how it became one of the main centers in the world of Jewish publishing. And there's been many, many Sfarim and things published there. And that was a Sephardi city. So when you kind of alluded to this, how they wanted the merchants, but talk a little bit about Livorno, Jewish origins, how it's a Sephardi city sitting in Italy.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say Livorno is the only city in Italy that was ever predominantly Sephardi. The other city where there was a strong Sephardi presence and economic influence was Venice. In Rome, there were some Sephardim, but that was not ever a dominant presence. So whoever has the impression of Italy being a Sephardi Jewish territory must have some Sephardi roots. I mean, Jews arrived in Italy back in very early ancient Roman times. And because of that, with the first exodus from Palestine and already with the destruction of the Second Temple. So because of that, there is the possibility of tracing a number of families to what is called Italian Jewry. And the one simple way of identifying those families is today to see their names for many generations or even centuries. They've had the names of towns, typically because they lived in towns where a certain feudal lord protected them. In fact, I think the most famous 20th century Livornese Jews was an Italian Jew, because Amedeo Modigliani, that last name is not a Sephardi name. By the early 18th century, there's a large influx of Italian Jews coming mostly from Rome that was suffering an economic decline. And that's when the clash between the Sephardi oligarchy in the community and these new families. But Primo Levi would be normally understood as being part of the Italian Jewish group. There's for those who watch Italian neo-realist movies, there's a devastating picture. There's a moment when the SS in one of the movies, by Rossellini, when they are trying to, the SS the Germans are picking up random members of the population, and they ask a woman, "What is your last name?" And she naively answers, and her last name is Modena, which is the name of a town, which is basically saying, "I'm Jewish." I mean, there are occasional situations, but it is more or less, so you don't need to say anything more. It's a devastating moment in that picture, in that movie picture. So there are many other examples, and there are Italianizations of Hebrew name. There's a lot of Jews who might be called Benedetto because of Baruch, which is they're funny, which is Benedetto sounds very Catholic, but it's actually so there's plenty of examples, but there are, and those are Italian Jews, Jews who have been living in the peninsula since Roman times. There are also some French Jews, so-called, because there were many medieval expulsions beginning in the 8th century from France. And France, is borders with Italy in the West. Some of your listeners may have read or heard of the autobiography of the Venetian rabbi Leon Modena. And he has now it escapes me, I think from his mother's side, he has French origin. And then, these things are all intermixed, but there's, are French Jewry different? Then there's an Ashkenazi component, because obviously Northern Italy, if another very common point of reference is the dramatically sad and devastating story of the ritual murder in the town of Trent, right, in the 15th century. So that very small community where the so-called killing of Simon of Trent, allegedly committed, obviously not committed by the Jews, but that was an that town. Today's in Italy. Today's in northern Italy, northeastern Italy. It's part of the Italian state. It's in a region that was contested between the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire in Italy through World War I, but at the time was literally just across the border and part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it was part of a principality. So, but it was bordering with the territory of the Venetian Republic. So, and it was a completely Ashkenazi German-speaking communities. And in the Venetian Republic, there were a lot of German-speaking Ashkenazi communities. And in Venice, too, the Venice ghetto had 3 communities. Had an Italian Ashkenazi community, had a Levantine so-called community of Jews who arrived from the Ottoman Empire, mostly who had originally previously been in Iberia. But as you know, in the Ottoman Empire, there are Ashkenazi community. And then it had a Ponentine, so-called, basically Spanish Portuguese community that built the richest of its synagogues. And so similarly across but the Spanish Portuguese, the so-called Sephardic communities are the latest to arrive in Italy. When they arrive in the second half of the 16th century, they tend to be well-to-do, and they tend to be resented by the Italian and the Ashkenazi. In Modena's autobiography, he has not very kind words toward the Sephardim. If you want, which there are plenty, evidence of intra-Jewish acrimonious tensions, you just look for text in which there are the arrival of the Sephardim, and then you see that the words used toward them are, there's resentment. Those who arrive, those who are welcomed by the Christian authorities are the well-to-do. It's also those who usually had stayed in Spain for longer, while the poorest one had gone to the Ottoman Empire or to Morocco for the most part. So no, Italy is not a predominantly Sephardic Jewish community. It's also very small. The peak number of Jews in the Italian peninsula was reached somewhere around the middle of the 19th century with 55,000 Jews, which from an American or Israeli point of view is just risible, And I think that, I'm not sure, but if I have to guess, I would imagine that Primo Levi is probably the most famous Jews that people know of, or from Italy, or, but.
I would jump in. I would venture to say maybe, but that probably be from modern Jews. I think from a lot of people may be familiar with the older Jews, like
Okay.
Ravadia Sforno,
Yeah.
Ravadia Bartanura,
Okay.
or well, it wasn't exactly totally Italian. He moved to Italy, I think, to Marek. Joseph
Uh-huh.
Cohen, his last name is similar to yours, right? It was like Travato or something. It was pretty.
Okay.
Yes, he
Yeah.
made.
So
Well, there are a
yeah,
lot of because there were a lot of famous and this is interesting. To
scholars.
pick up on,
Yes.
yeah, what you're saying, Rabbanim, rabbis throughout the years and the centuries, and these communities were tiny. 20,
Yes.
30 families, 40 families, and obviously throughout, especially throughout the 16th century, Italy was the Jewish publishing capital of the world. And they had, not only people coming to print their books there, they had many published, people publishing there. And these were forgotten figures, unknown figures, a lot of them. I mean, the Ramami Fano, Menachem Azaria Fano.
Yes.
I mean, so there are those that are.
Yeah, like Modena,
Yeah, him as
these
well.
are small communities, but they were extremely rich intellectually. But think that, Southern Italy, Naples and Sicily were ruled for the most part by Spain. So there was a delay, it was not, but in Sicily, Jews were expelled in 1492 at the same time, in Naples in 1541. But so basically from the middle of the 16th century onward, there were no Jews in Southern Italy. Well, it's a huge, like it's half of the Italian peninsula. So, they're Jews in this scattered little, it's Rome, Venice, Livorno, Milan, and Turin, and a few, as you said, the tiny, they're this small town that have these deep Jewish, in Tuscany, there are also these small towns, with a deep Jewish tradition. Some have wonderful culinary traditions, I should add on the side. But they were tiny families, a banking families, a rabbi family, their small entourage. They were some more precarious, some more rooted. But it's nothing comparable to the world of Poland or to the world of the Ottoman Empire. And for North American Jews in particular, I think it has not left a lot of traces in North America. There's not a big diaspora. There are a few important individuals, but there's not a large Italian Jewish community in North America that can speak to that world. So I think it's important to bring it to life and to make it more familiar.
Yeah, and I realize there's even more. I mean, I'm sure listeners will write into me with more, but I mean, Nazari de Rossi and the Ramchal, Ramesh Chaim
Yes.
Lutzato, and Shadal Shmuel David Lutzato. I mean, they actually, if you think about it, there are so many famous Italians that people.
Yeah, no, for those who are scholars, for sure. For those who are scholars, for sure. But in terms of a general familiarity, that in terms of the social world, I was thinking more about what the social world of these communities might be. Rather than the textual tradition.
Right, absolutely. I mean that makes sense. I mean, and maybe we'll mention some that maybe not known anymore in Livorno. So, getting back to Livorno, I mean, I don't know. So we mentioned it became Sephardi and it was settled by these Sephardim. I don't know how you want to attack this, so to speak. Do you want to discuss famous Jews of Livorno? You can work backwards or forwards, and we can.
You asked me, and I should say, that's. Because of my interest, that's sort of not, I don't write, and I don't, so much about the scholarly world of these Jewish learned rabbis. But I should preface by saying that I've always been extremely fascinated by the fact that in these Sephardic families, there is literally my book has some pretty extensive genealogical trees. And that is because my point of view is I don't believe that everybody who has the same last name, that is how trust functions. And you just meet another guy with the same name. My whole point in the book is now how these business transactions really work. And in fact, the book ends with, two Jews who go bankrupt because they trust the wrong Iranian Jews who they don't know a lot about it. And so I draw these genealogical trees to understand exactly how capital flew, and how dowries and how marital relations was constructed, because I think devil is in the detail, and I want to understand how these families built their own social networks. And in the process of doing so, it's extraordinary to see how, there may be 4 brothers, and one becomes an extraordinary learned rabbi, and 3 go into business. Now, this is very common in the history of Jews, but has culturally, in the history of the Western Sephardic diaspora, very specific implications. So in the case of the family I studied, I studied 2 families, and one of the 2, his last name is Ergas. And in the 17th century, one of the most famous rabbis in Livorno, who also was quite famous across Europe, is Joseph ben Emmanuel Ergas, who was a really renowned Kabbalist who engaged in a pan-European anti-Shabbatian polemic, and was widely published. His works appear in London, in Amsterdam. His works were then published in Livorno by his disciples. He's a figure of, he was a quasi-saint during his life. He was a figure of extraordinary learning and renown. Now, I don't know whether you're, maybe I'm trivializing a little bit, but, you can imagine this as a very venerable man with a very long beard and in his very traditional garments. Now, his brothers, nephews, and cousins in the Western Sephardic diaspora, these are men and families who, within quote, return to Judaism after having lived themselves or their ancestors as Christians, because everybody in the peninsula, in Iberia, had to be baptized, okay? So either themselves or probably their ancestor had been Christians, Catholic. So by then, over the generation, they took up, they were fluent in Portuguese. And, his brothers, they probably knew the prayers. They knew some Hebrew, but they didn't know a lot of Hebrew, right? And they shaved their beard. We have written evidence. I found an extraordinary portrait from 1630 in a private collection of one of these men from the ghetto of Venice. And he has a wig exactly like a nobleman in Venice and is completely shaved. He is, and Jewish historians have written about these shaved men who have found a new form of accommodation. They most likely observe the kashrut. We don't know to which level of detail, but there are other aspects that are completely, I have their business letter on Christmas Day. They send their greetings to the Grand Duke and say, happy, Merry Christmas. And yet they sit at the table with their brother or cousins who reads the prayer. So it is for being, Joseph Ergas died in 1730. For being 1730, you don't have anything of the sort in Poland. You don't have anything of the sort in the Ottoman Empire. You have something like this in Livorno, in Venice, in Amsterdam, and in London. It's just a small phenomena, which is extraordinary. It is not assimilation. It is not the world of 19th century Germany. It is something different that needs to be studied for this mixture that it is. And I don't think it is just a precursor of what comes later. So he was a very famous Livornese. Go ahead.
So I want to jump in before we get to others. So he is still very famous today. I mean, listeners may know him as the author of the Shemer Emunim, which, because there's a Hasidic Rebbe, the Shemer Emunim, so he became known as the Shemer Emunim HaKadmoin, the original, the old Shemer Emunim. So that was his famous, one of his famous works. He obviously was a very big makobel, like you said, very, very famous. I mean, interestingly, I'll just point out that, first of all, that the beers, interestingly, so a lot of the Italian rabbinate, so to speak, let's just call them, did not also shave. I mean, a lot of Italian Jews, we know this. There was and I know in the Shal Shuva Shemer Tzedakah, more Porgo, I'll throw in, there's a question there about shaving. I think Rami Fano, listeners may know more than this than I do. There is talk of them shaving, but obviously here they were Sephardim, so I don't know, obviously different. But and then something else you mentioned, how this was not the Haskalah, this was something very different, and listeners should understand that, I think, I mean, you can speak to this. I mean, Italy as a whole, even in Venice or elsewhere, wherever else, was this kind of interesting Italian Jewry. Part of what's so fascinating, they were very different. They always, I don't know, read literature while learning, the regular traditional text. It was not the kind of the same thing as elsewhere, especially not as in Poland. It's certainly not in Livorno, but I'm saying, as a general rule, Italy was different in this regard, right? Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I have to defer to you about the beard of the learned man and about a lot of other things. I can tell you that the Sephardic, the Westerns, as they are often referred to a bit more technically, the Western Sephardic merchants, the non-rabbis in these Livornese families of Iberian origins were far more acculturated than the Italian and Ashkenazi Jews of the very same period. That some Italian Jews became very wealthy and they took up the same mores and they kind of want to imitate the Sephardim, but it was a process of imitation of the Sephardim, if you wish. So but it's the Sephardim who brought this phenomena to Italy. It was particularly pronounced in Amsterdam, which would be a community that is better known to your listener or more present in the public imagination, if you wish. There's a great Israeli scholar at the University of Jerusalem, Yosef Kaplan, who is a specialist of the Western Sephardic Spanish-Portuguese community of Amsterdam, who has coined an expression in Portuguese to describe this particular form of acculturation, and he speaks of bon judaisme. Bon judaisme, which is sort of a good, a decent, I have to find the appropriate, a Judaism that is palatable to the Gentiles, a Judaism that is, adapted to the forms, to the outside forms of the Dutch Golden Age. And that captures extremely well, and in terms of size, the Livorno Jewish community by the 18th century is very much, it's a little smaller than the Amsterdam community, but Livorno is tiny compared to Amsterdam. In the middle of the 17th century, there are about 1,500 Jews in Livorno, and by 1800 there are 5,000 Jews, which is extraordinary for Italy. And there are Jews in Livorno. What is extraordinary is they're 10% of the total population, which it's not something that exists anywhere else in the Italian peninsula. So they are a social and a cultural presence that marks the texture of the town in ways that it doesn't exist elsewhere. And please, you were about to say something.
Sorry. I just want to, and this part I'll defer to you. I mean, you know this, that the other Italian Jews, I didn't mean to equate them with the Sephardi Jews. I think that's very different. And as a general rule, you're saying they were different. I need more nuance. I think I just meant Italy as a whole was not Poland. That, that's all I meant. That even the standard Jews, right? I think it's fair to say just merely that statement without it going any more,
Mm-hmm.
But I think you were discussing the other famous Jews of Livorno throughout the centuries, and obviously there are many, but I know you had a couple perhaps that you wanted.
Well, I wanted to mention some that are more obscure. I think that I'd like to bring them up. The first is a man without whom the Jewish community of Livorno, probably wouldn't exist. Obviously, it's a kind of counterfactual, one can never demonstrate. But anyway, he was instrumental in outlining the terms of the privileges that were issued to the Jewish community. His name is Maggino Gabrieli, Maggino, the son of Gabriello. A lot of names at the time, people didn't really have last names, or their last names were kind of their patronymic. It's a very curious 16th century figure, a kind of emblematic and yet enigmatic Jews of the time who moved all across Italy and all across the Habsburg Empire. To him, we owe new inventions for the manufacturing of silk and of glass. He wrote a treatise on how to, manufacture silk. He was also an extraordinary skilled, political broker. And wherever he went, he not only acquired for himself these technical licenses, but he also, in this case, he mediated with the Medici families, with the Medici Grand Dukes, to have more favorable rights or privileges for the Jews. Because I said these patents were actually two, 1581 and 1583. So in 1581, the Medici issues this invitation to a number of ethnic and religious minorities doing business across the Mediterranean and says, we have this new beautiful port city, come and settle here. And it is Maggino who prepares some demands to have a new patents that give Jews more specific rights to the Jews in particular that are tailored to them. And the Medici accept. So, it speaks, we always say, Jews did not have their own state for all these centuries, and Jews did not have political power. That's an important trope in Jewish history, that after the destruction of the ancient kingdom of Palestine, there's a kind of a political vacuum in in Jewish history, or there's Jewish passivity and this kind of things. But there are others, historians, who think that they bring out episodes in which Jews, although deprived of their own sovereign authority, there are individual or groups who, working from the margins or as intermediators, actually achieve some of their objectives through skillful mediation. I'm not equating, want to be misunderstood, this mediation with the exercise of one's own political, sovereignty. But these are interesting episodes because in the end, the patent that the Medici issue, for example, creates a Jewish lay tribunal with jurisdiction over all civil disputes between Jews, which is unique in the entire Sephardic and Jewish diaspora in Europe. or in the Ottoman Empire. So nowhere else, I mean, there are Jewish religious tribunals, obviously, but nowhere else did they exist at the time. Tribunals, there were 5 elected syndics of the Jewish community on a rotational basis. And every time there was a litigation between 2 Jews, they had to go before this Jewish tribunal. And this Jewish tribunal adjudicated on the basis of a very eclectic range of legal sources, halakha, but also local statutes of Tuscany, commercial law, because it depended, you could have family issues, but you could also have commercial issues, debts, and all kind of particularly debts, as you can imagine, unpaid credit and so forth. Because in the Sephardic communities, and we can talk about this, it's a very interesting situation. These merchants want to keep rabbis at bay. So this tribunal can consult rabbis, and we have in these tribunals paper in the archives, which are located today still in a room adjacent to the synagogue in Livorno. We have the consultation that the rabbis wrote, but the rabbis were not issuing the final verdict. In Amsterdam, the state never gave the Jewish community the same authority. That is a complicated story. I think that's because the Dutch state was a stronger state and didn't give any foreign community, never delegated to any foreign community that level of autonomy. Instead, the Medici were a weaker state, and they kind of were also happy to delegate some of that authority. You can see it in those terms, or you can also see somebody like this guy, Magino, succeeding in achieving for the Jewish community a level of jurisdictional autonomy that was absolutely extraordinary for the time, that in Venice Jews always demanded and never achieved. So he was a very important figure, frankly, completely underrated in the history of pre-modern Judaism. So he should be known, and I'm thankful for the opportunity of bringing to the attention of your listeners. Another completely underrated figure, we're jumping ahead by 200 years, we're now in the early 18th century, is the Livornese Rabbi Yosef Attias, Attias, which is a very typical Sephardi Livornese name. He was an incredibly learned and cosmopolitan member of the Republic of Letters. He was a personal friend of the Grand Dukes. He corresponded with Giambattista Vico. He had a vast personal library. He is an extraordinary local historian, Lucia Frattarelli Fischer, in Livorno, located the inventory of his library in the archives a few years ago and published it in her book. So we know there were, when he died, at least an inventory was made with 1,250 books. Some were religious books. Some were the great works of the Enlightenment. Some were books that the Medici would have had under censorship. So the range of his knowledge was extraordinary. But whatever he wrote, he never published. So he held a salon, like the great salon of the 18th century, where everybody went, consulted his library. He held these very high-level conversations. When Montesquieu took his requisite tour of Italy, stopped in his private diary. He speaks of having met with Rabbi Attias and having had a learned conversation with him. So it was a point of reference for figures of the statue of Montesquieu, but he did not leave any of his own words. And so he's not known today, which is really a pity. Jumping to the 19th century, I would only mention someone who is Rabbi Elia ben Amotzeg, who died in 1900, who's a very interesting figure about whom others know more than I do, because he was at once a kind of a Jewish universalist and a really Italian patriot during the late 19th century, when Italy, as you mentioned, went through the process of unification, of going through this period called the Risorgimento, when all these little regional states became, a nation state kingdom. And again, it's not well known, but it's a curious figures.
Yeah, and Leo ben Amozeg, he had his printing press for a while. He published many works in Hebrew and French. And I did a podcast with Professor Clemence Boulouk on him about her book. So I
should listen to it.
You can definitely listen to it. The listeners who haven't can as well. It was about a while ago from this. So that did that as well. I'll just mention before we get on, I think the last one you get on to the 20th century, I guess. I'll mention a couple of others. Yad Malachi, people may be familiar with, Malachi Cohen, who was a famous work. He was in Livorno, and then there was others that stopped there, that lived there at various times. The Chida, Chaim Yosef David Azulai stopped there. I believe he lived there.
Yes.
And also Emmanuel Chayriki also was there for a time, lived there throughout, stopped there. So there are many others. I'm sure that I'm forgetting that were there as well. So it was really it had a lot of famous, like you're saying, rabbis and merchants, and it was just a real interesting blend of a city. But I know you had one more, I think, that you wanted to get to.
Well, I mentioned him earlier that, in fact, in the during the 19th and 20th century, Livorno was no longer a very rich port. It first declined during the Napoleonic blockade, and then during the 20th century. Today, it's sadly a very impoverished town, mostly because the port is not deep and large enough for the Chinese cargoes. This is what globalization is made of, these gigantic cargoes going around. And some like Athens had a big Chinese rebuild its port to be able to, but, so they are trying to revitalize it a little bit with some cruises, pre-COVID. But the economy that was built around the port declined through much of the 19th and 20th century. A lot of Jews during the 19th century actually left for the Ottoman Empire. There was a large Sephardi communities went to Egypt and Salonika. Interesting inversion. That's where the business was to be made. The family I studied, the Ergas, was part of these exodus from Livorno to the Ottoman Empire. But I think the 20th century most famous Livornese is Amedeo Modigliani, the artist. There are a few others. There was another artist, the Fattori. There's a big villa with his works there. Modigliani died in Paris. He moved there, died in Paris in 1920. But his works, his sculptures and his paintings, the famous elongated faces, are known, and they're held in museums all around the world. And I don't know how many people know he's from Livorno. I think he's associated with this Parisian avant-garde, but he is the product of his parents were both from Livorno. So, today there's obviously a crisis. Most rabbis in Livorno, as everywhere in Italy, come from North Africa still, or from Israel. It's they're originally Sephardic from North Africa via Israel. It's a small world. There's there's some 600 Jews today in Livorno, when there were 5,000 in the 1800s. There's about 30,000 Jews in Italy today, total. So it's a small community, sort of, in a lot of American towns. There's that there's that number. The largest community is in Rome. There's about 13,000 Jews in Rome. Milan is the second, and then even Turin, which is the famous intellectual, community. It's very tiny. There's some 800 Jews, and Venice is the same size as Livorno. There's maximum 600 Jews. It's sort of very diminished from both Livorno and Venice, which were the two Sephardic capitals in the Renaissance, have been very diminished. Sometimes I feel I don't go back to Italy as often, but there's I always see these American tourists. Not so much in Livorno. It's a trek to get to Livorno. I mean, you have to take there's some tourists make it to Pisa, and then you have to take another bus or another train. But obviously, people go to Venice, and in Venice, there's in the ghetto now, there's a bit of a tourist industry that caters to American tourists and present, there's a Chabad, there's a kosher restaurant, all things that are not native to the ghetto, that are more catered to American and Israeli tourists that obviously need to have some comfort and some image of themselves as well. But when I grew up there, I grew up in Venice, and there were definitely no, such things. But the Jewish ghetto in Venice has a very interesting museum, and that very well organized, with an excellent tour of the synagogues, and that's still very valuable.
Right. I mean, and you mentioned the numbers. I mean, I'm in the Lakewood, New Jersey area, and that is now, so much bigger than all the Jews in it, like you mentioned.
That's exactly.
The numbers are just.
But the numbers are important, I think, because there's a bit of a discrepancy between, the cultural influence of Italian Jewry, which is very profound and should be valued, and these numbers, and yet. I do think that there's a social life and a social texture that also, if you go to Livorno, it's still possible to find traces a bit of the Jewish life, because there's a lot that was bombed. But the synagogue is very, very new, so it's not like visiting the Venice ghetto, which is extraordinarily preserved. And but one can also, buy a guide and walk around. And there are ways of memorializing that the lost world in Livorno.
Yeah. So as we finish up, actually, I think we should mention the book a little bit, which does have, as we've discussed Livorno history, there is some in there, but obviously it's not about, exclusively history of the Jews of Livorno, as you mentioned in the book in the introduction, but the book is about these economic networks, mainly about the Ergas and the Silvera families. So just perhaps, discuss a little bit and mention a little bit what the book is focused on and researched.
Yeah, I think that what I started by digging into the archives. I mean, I was struck. I came across this extraordinary trove of letters, copies of the letters that this family of these two families were in business with each other, sent to all their business correspondents. And as I read through, a lot of names are of other Sephardim. There are Italian Jews, then some are Italian merchants. Okay. And then I start coming across really names I cannot make sense of in India, and take me a long time and find out that they are actually Hindus. And I'm like, what is this? And then there are a lot of Italians in Lisbon, and there's some Dutch, and there's some French. So to make a long story short, I end up realizing that most of the literature in the academic world is still was at least some 15 years ago when I wrote the book. And I think I made a dent. So hopefully it's not now, but was really polarized between an assumption that Jews trade with Jews in the same way as Armenians trade with Armenians, Huguenots trade with Huguenots, Greek, that in this pre-modern world in which transportation is very risky because information flows is fragile. You don't know when something arrives at the end of, the other side of the ocean. You don't know if the person to whom you send it is going to cheat on you, and you don't know if the tribunal will take your side and enforce your contract. So better stick with your own. That was one side of the literature. The other side of the literature was like, by the 17th, 18th century, there's a construction of a modern state in which tribunals are getting more impartial, and recourse to the law is getting cheaper. And in the end, merchants are more and more insensitive to religion. Everybody just wants to make money, and, business will bring peace and prosperity. People don't look at religious identity as long as they can make a deal. And, both stories are too simple. And in fact, if you dig into details, and you will be surprised, but there are no business history of how Jews did trade. Because a lot of Jewish history is intellectual religious history, or the history of institutions. How did the community emerge, And even the great Zeller Baron, the social and religious history, the social history is mostly a history of religious communities. The communities emerged, did this, and it's a history of the institutions of the community. And in fact, there is not what I call the business history of Jewish trade, because there is an assumption that the Jewish family was the nucleus of Jewish trade. And so by going into the detail, I try to do a micro history of a global world. By going into the detail, I find really how both things are true. Jews do certain things, this family does certain specific things only with Jews because a very high degree of trust is needed in order to form the partnerships. And then they build a very large, very, very, very geographically, very, very large networks of selective form of cooperation with a huge range of agents who include Catholic, Protestants, and Hindus, with whom they take very selective risks that go up to a point. And these very heterogeneous business networks do not bring to the dissolution of their cultural and religious world. So the two conventional stories are frankly both false. Jews are not insular, were not insular in their business networks, and doing business outside of the community that does not threaten the cultural and religious boundaries of the community. And I draw some very large conclusions from these findings about the nature of pre-modern capitalism and about the potential implications of the story for how we think about the development of capitalism. And without wanting to be, too sadly prophetic, I think that we live in a world that is very capitalistic and in which religion is very present. So I think that what I found makes a lot of sense, and that we are still, a lot of my colleagues are still telling the story about how, the Enlightenment and Protestantism brought the development of capitalism. I just can't wrap my mind around how we can still tell those old stories. But I do think that one has to do a lot, particularly in Jewish history, and particularly in this relationship between Jews and non-Jews. There is a lot of archival excavation that we need to do because, Jewish history in its modern academic form, particularly social and economic history, is very recent compared, as a discipline. It's very recent. It's and these are questions that have simply not interested Jewish historians very much for the way in which the discipline has developed. So I was very happy when some in the field of Jewish history accepted some of the conclusion that an interloper like me put forth, and I will be happy to be, questioned or to be engaged by others. But I do think that we need to do a bit more empirical work and really try to understand with this very complicated pre-emancipation world that in part of the Jewish diaspora was one that was not either segregated or integrated. It's, and the Western Sephardic diaspora, it's an extraordinary laboratory to understand this mixture, because as you said, there are some great learned rabbis, and on the other hand, as I've been studying, there are merchants who went hand in hand with the great financiers and political Christian rulers of the time, and the two things are absolutely not in contradictions. We just have to dig deeper and to think in more creative ways about which kind of Jewish world and which kind of European world this was.
Yeah, and I'll for the listeners, I'll include the link to the book in the show's notes. It's Yale University Press, and it's definitely, like you're saying, it's a social and an economic history. If anyone wants to read, that's something different than the standard book they may come across, even an academic book, and it's a different kind of a history. I do want to also mention here as we finish up that you have a more recent book. Actually, it was recently just, I think, came out now in paperback as well, so it's cheaper, is The Promise and Peril of Credit, which you published through Princeton University Press, and maybe for a future podcast episode, but if you just would like to mention, what that book is about.
Well, this is really a book about a forgotten chapter in Christian anti-Semitic images of Jewish practices in the handling of money. And it's a riveting, absurd, but really lasting story that emerged in the middle of the 17th century, according to which Jews invented the instrument of modern capitalism. And the story is so absurd that modern historians, after the interwar period, forgot to write, forgot it, just stopped writing about it. But until the interwar period, until, before Second World War, this story was everywhere. And so I reconstructed the story, both because it's really a link between medieval and modern images, it's really a link between the image of the medieval usurer and the modern presumed international financial banker who's a mover and shaker of international finance. And you don't understand how the two are connected, or the two sides of the two coins of the same coin, without this missing link. And because, again, for my purposes, it says a lot about the dark sides and the fact that the fears of the anonymity of financial capitalism were for so many centuries expressed in these anti-Semitic tropes. So it's really a history of the Christian images of Jews. It's less a history of, it has nothing to do with what Jews did, unlike the book on Livorno. But it is hard to separate the two things sometimes, because the laws that were written about what Jews could do often were shaped by very distorted images of what Christian rulers imagined Jews actually did. So I do think there's still value for Jewish history to expand our understanding of anti-Semitism.
Okay, interesting. So I'll include the link to that one as well. And just finally, are you working on any current new projects?
Well, I'm working on projects that are only partially related to Jewish history, but I'm continuing part of my current business history work. Has a bit more technical, but is related to why a particular kind of contract that is supposed to make everybody who has money use it, and irrespective of religious identity. And in fact, I find that Jews and Christians who would normally, according to theory, not normally, but according to the theoretical premises of legal historians and economic historians, would join their capital together in this pre-modern Tuscan world. They actually don't use it. So I'm trying again to try to mix the cultural history and the legal history to try to understand what prevented Jews and Christians from using what is supposed to be the most efficient way of doing business together. And I'm just fascinated by the fact that they did do some business together, but that sadly, in a way, doing business together is not the solution to all our problems. Otherwise, the world will be in a better place.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Very, very interesting. So once again, thank you very much for joining me to discuss the book and Livorno and the Jewish community as a whole. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Naki. It's been a great pleasure, and best of luck with this great project that you launched.
Thank you. Be well.